This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello, I'm back with a new series of Feedback, the programme that gives BBC executives sleepless nights, or so some listeners hope. Sir Michael Lyons is now sleeping soundly as he completed his tour of duty as chairman of the BBC Trust while we were off the air. In his place is Lord Patton, who's been staying up late watching all those distressingly popular programmes on BBC One and listening to all those Radio 1 shows that previously, in his private life, he assiduously avoided. What keeps you awake at night? Many fans of the station formerly known as BBC Radio 7 loved listening to some gripping whodunits in the early hours of the morning and were dismayed when they were replaced by comedies. Well, have you ever managed to laugh yourself to sleep? The boss of the now retitled 4 Extra explains how she's responded to your clamorous demands for a return to the criminal underworld.
One of the big complaints was we are missing our early morning crime and thrillers. We had swapped it for comedy. Now, I sat up several late nights listening and what is it here? And actually, I thought, they're right. You do want to continue with a crime and thriller. And you know what? After 4 weeks of being on air, I tweaked the schedule to change that.
But some lovers of Radio 4's late-night book readings don't want their timbers shivered late at night. Has Radio 4's book at bedtime got something of the night about it? And Gwyneth Williams, the controller of Radio 4, reveals how she squashed plans to move the Archers from Radio 4 onto 4 Extra. Research for the BBC Trust discovered that most of those who actually listened to Radio 7 loved it. But there weren't enough of you, hence the rebranding. But many of our correspondents are unhappy about what has been lost in the changeover.
My name's Mike Massey, and I got in touch with Feedback because I'm absolutely livid that my favourite radio channel has been trashed and replaced by Radio 4 Extra.
BBC Radio 4 Extra.
My name's Peter Clark, and I just want to say how dismayed I am by the damage that's been done to BBC Radio 7 by the introduction of seemingly the most trivial elements of Radio 4, which now dominate the schedule and have changed the entire character of the station.
We've been given an EastEnders type Archers. Arthur Smith seems to be on every single day.
Hosted by me, Arthur Smith.
Comedies which I suppose younger people might find funny, and programmes I heard on Radio 4 only a few days ago.
My name is Pauline Midwinter. My husband and I had put a radio alarm clock into our daughter's bedroom as she's 2 years old. I didn't realise the provision for children's radio would just disappear, so I was very surprised when I went in and found her wide-eyed listening to DL and Pasco.
Arnie Stringer opened his eyes for the last time at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
I want to know who asked you to change it, why did you change it, and who told you that this would be better than the old Radio 7? Give me back my radio station.
Mr. Gus tweeted at BBC R4 Feedback to lament the changes to children's programming on 4 Extra, asking, "To whom do I send my bill for 6 DAB radios which no longer broadcast CBeebies? They said they wanted a younger audience." So, just a few of the 80 or so emails and comments we've had so far since the metamorphosis of 4 Extra 6 weeks ago, and that's on top of lots of comments on the Radio 4 blog, mostly negative. Feedback listener Ray Streets from Cambridge and John Shillard from Barnsley joined me to discuss some of their concerns with Mary Callum-Kerrion, once head of Radio 7, now Radio 4 Extra's head of programming. I started by asking her whether the size of the audience was the key reason for renaming the station.
Radio 7 had a very low awareness, the lowest awareness of all the BBC digital networks. It had been quite successful in listening terms, but the listenership was tailing off a bit. My brief was not to make radical changes, and indeed about 85% of the schedule is the same as Radio 7.
Right, well, Ray Streets, what was it you loved about BBC Radio 7, it was formerly known, and that you mourn the passing of?
The distinctive difference from Radio 4. There's a rhythm to each channel, which means if you switch on, you know which one it is without being told. The pattern of mainly longer drama or comedy or single speaker programmes was what was really nice as a listener's experience. Now we have the same sort of choppy magazine feel to far more of 7.
Well, Ray, I'm really sorry to hear you feel that, because I looked at what is there on Radio 7 that the listeners love, that it is totally different from Radio 4. Now, the first thing is the classic comedy. We've kept that in the same place. You've got your classic drama. We've retained the crime and thrillers, and those are all stripped across the week in a way that Radio 4 would never do.
Yes, but a lot of emails to us are lamenting, mourning the loss of longer form drama.
Well, I'll answer that. We still have our 60 hours classic serial stripped across the week. We've retained the Saturday 90-minute drama. Now, we'll also have at the weekend, in longer form, we have an omnibus of the Woman's Hour drama. Now, that was popular.
Yes, so that's extra, very rapid repeating from Radio 4, which was something BBC 7 didn't do before.
We knew that the introduction of our archive Woman's Hour drama as an omnibus at the weekend,
I think
listeners
I would
like
dispute
that.
archive as opposed to repeat. Archive, I think, allows a slightly longer passage of time, and what you're talking about now is repeating something that has already been on earlier on in the week.
This network is only 6 weeks old. Do you know, nothing is totally set in stone, and we're looking at it.
I'll bring in John Shellard here, who's been listening in from Sheffield. And there are some of the changes in the regular slots that you have some reservations about.
As an insomniac, I tended to listen to the crime hours between 1 and 2, and I just about made it to the end of the programmes before dropping off to sleep. You move those until to replace your children's programmes. I noticed this week, incidentally, thank you for shooting me fox, but you've put them back again.
Have you shot the fox?
Right,
is the fox dead?
I like your expression. Now, one of the big complaints was we are missing our early morning crime and thrillers. We had swapped it for comedy. Now, I sat up several late nights listening, and what is it here? And actually, I thought, they're right. You've got your block of science fiction at midnight, which we always had, and I thought, you do want to continue with a crime and thriller. And you know what? After 4 weeks of being on air, I tweaked the schedule to change that, and we have had some good feedback from listeners who appreciate that.
OK, can I go on the question of Ambridge Extra? John, what did you think about that? Do you feel that it really adds to your enjoyment of Ambridge and develops storylines with characters you didn't know a great deal about?
To be quite honest, I started listening to it. I think it's such a load of basically useless rubbish. I don't listen to it anymore. Now, I am an avid Ambridge Archers listener, and I certainly love to listen to the omnibus on a Sunday. I certainly do not follow that by going over to Radio 4 Extra to listen to the Ambridge Extra.
Now, with Ambridge Extra, because it is a new drama, and new dramas are not cheap, we have commissioned that until July. We've got a summer break, and this will give us time to look at it. Who are listening to this? How many listeners are we pulling in? Are we bringing over the Radio 4 listeners? All this will be analysed. I think it's well worth a try. Some listeners are loving it. In fact, I have to say, within the first few weeks on the iPod chart, Ambridge Extra was number 2 ahead of Chris Moyles. Radio 4 listeners, they like good speech radio, and we thought, well, why shouldn't they be coming over to us? We should be offering something complimentary and an alternative good listen.
So why put Desert Island Discs on there?
A good reason for this. I'm very glad you brought that up as well. Now, in the first few weeks, we brought in children's authors. And what we do is, you hear their Desert Island Discs from several years back. You get an update on what they've done, and then you hear some of their programming on the network, which is why we have Michael Merpargo, because we've had Warhorse on the network with some of his programmes.
And finally, can I ask you, John, first, could you recommend 4 Extra at the moment to listeners that it's worth their time going and listening to?
It's always been worth their time listening to. I mean, I bought a digital radio to listen to it, but I don't think they should mess and tinker too much with it. There are far too many repeats at the moment that just cycle round year after year, and I'm afraid Desert Island Discs adds absolutely nothing to it apart from putting me back on Radio 5.
Ray, do you think you can recommend 4 Extra to your friends?
I would probably half-heartedly recommend some bits of it, and the bits you've held over from before, right, especially the crime and the science fiction broadcasting, but I feel the rest has been diluted almost beyond recognition. And finally, Mary Callum-Carrion, when do you get your first results in? When will you know if the audience has gone up?
The next RAJAR figures are in August. It's essential for us to know who is listening and how many. As one reviewer said, and I rather liked it, we used to be the second cousins to Radio 4. We're now a true sister to Radio 4.
Mary Callum-Carrion and listeners Ray Streets and John Shellard. And let's hope there's no sibling rivalry between 4 Extra and her big sister. Well, Gwyneth Williams is controller of them both, and we'll be hearing from her a little later in feedback. Ironically, we now know that in its dying days more people than ever were listening to BBC Radio 7, according to the latest figures. In fact, radio listening is at record levels in the UK, as figures for Radio 1, Radio 1 Extra and 6 Music have all increased, as have those for Radio 4, with the Today programme enjoying record audiences. Radio 5 Live listeners are also up on last year's total of nearly 6.5 million. This listener appears to have had a disastrous affair with it. Tony called the Victoria Derbyshire show to say this.
My missus left me over 5 Live.
Are you pulling my leg?
No. I used to have a shop, and the thing was that I used to have the radio on in the shop all day, but when I came home, 6 o'clock at night, I wasn't allowed to listen to the radio in the evening. But the thing is, when I gave the shop up, and, I retired, I used to start putting the radio on through the day. Well, it caused a lot of disputes.
I just don't believe that, Tony. So what would your wife be saying? Turn the radio off and you'd say no, and that was the dispute? Or was she saying, I can't stand that 5 Live, there's too much football and not enough minority sports?
Well, the letter that came from the solicitor said that my preoccupation with the radio had led to a complete breakdown of any social interaction between us.
Sorry, I know I shouldn't laugh at that, but that is funny.
Well, that's what he said. And at one point, I was in the conservatory listening to, whoever it was, I don't know. And she came in, and she threw the radio on the floor and stamped on it. But she still couldn't make it stop. So, of course, then she yanked the wire out of the wall, and the radio finished up at the bottom of the garden.
Things appear to be on a rather calmer footing in the Williams household near Egham in Surrey, where Mum Shan and her 2 sons Matthew and Richard all listen to and love Radio 4. They came into the studio to give us the uncensored details of their passionate affair.
We've got a radio on pretty much the minute anyone wakes up, the first person who goes downstairs.
It's 7 o'clock on Tuesday, the 15th of March. The headlines.
There was some stuff on the radio news about Radio 4 having to attract a wider, younger audience. I thought, well, actually, there's a lot that it's got to offer all ages, not just older people.
I'm Matthew Williams. I'm 15 years of age.
I'm Richard Williams. I am 11 years old.
The programmes I particularly like on Radio 4 are The Now Show, The News Quiz, Count Arthur Strong, Des Island. Did I say Des Island Disc?
I have a little USB stick which I get podcasts from and listen to all my favourite ones, which include Infinite Monkey Cage with my hero Brian Cox. It's a bit jokey, but they do have some serious elements to it, which I like the balance there.
Welcome to the Infinite Monkey Cage, the show that thinks it thinks, therefore it might be.
And they have Professor Brian Cox, who's the presenter of it, and this other person who I forget what his name is, but he's very funny.
I think I am Robin Ince, but every now and again I do worry there might be a brain in a vat. So if it wasn't enough to worry
I think the Infinite Monkey Cage don't expect people of 11 years old to be listening. I think they imagine people around 25 to 45. That's very exact, but it's just a rough estimate.
I really like More or Less because that tends to surprise me. It's a maths programme and yet it's full of quite quirky and interesting information.
This week, we'll be asking how unemployment can both rise and, in the same news story, stay the same.
I discovered recently that my husband actually really quite likes listening to Gardener's Question Time, even though he's not a gardener. And he said it's because they sound like they're enjoying themselves so much.
Have you tried numbering the pieces of gravel?
I've chosen my desert island discs. I don't think that my choices are what the typical Radio 4 listener would listen to. A band called Bring Me the Horizon, which are from Sheffield. The song's called Chelsea's Smile, Slipknot, and mostly metal. I think that people choose stuff to sound good because if the music is going out to the typical Radio 4 listener, which has been stereotyped by a middle-class, middle-aged man who sits there having a nice glass of whiskey before he goes to bed, then they're not really going to want to have all the rap from the 80s or whenever they were growing up.
My castaway this week is Kathy Burke.
I was quite surprised by when Kathy Burke chose Lady Gaga. Oh, I thought it was a good choice because she was being honest rather than being all pretentious and saying she wanted Mozart symphonies and stuff like that.
And this track in particular, I just think is brilliant, and you cannot help but get up and dance. And when I'm on the island, I want to dance.
Ra ra rama rama gaga ooh la la what your barra.
Our thanks to the Williams family of Egham, who are listening to us even now. Feedback listener Matthew Taylor is ill and stuck at home at the moment, but he's alleviated the tedium by making his own recording of the feedback contact details for us. How kind of him. Take it away, Matt.
You can write to Feedback, P.O. Box 67234, London SE1P 4AX, or leave phone messages on 03333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can email feedback@bbc.co.uk. All those details are also on our website.
Get well soon, Matthew. His friends tell him he has a good voice for radio. My friends tell me I have a good face for it. Well, if you have a nervous disposition, don't go and look at my photo on our website, but you can go there to sign up for the Feedback podcast and find a link to my blog. And please do let me know your thoughts on anything you've heard on the radio this week. Now, at the beginning of the last series of Feedback, I spoke to Gwyneth Williams, the controller of Radio 4, who's been in the hot seat now for almost 9 months. Shortly after her appointment, she told me about some of the changes she's planning to make, including a new science slot on Tuesday mornings, more comedy on Sunday nights, and a more international feel for the station. Then she went into a sort of purdah, as she struggled with the need to make savings as well as to refresh her network further. She emerged on Wednesday evening for a conversation with the radio critic Gillian Reynolds. It was in front of members of the Voice of the Listener and Viewer, which champions the views of the licence fee payer, and they also asked Gwyneth Williams questions of their own. Gillian Reynolds wanted to know if it was true that someone had suggested that the Archers should be moved from Radio 4 to 4 Extra to help the digital station get more listeners.
I was convinced that would have been the wrong decision. It's such an important moment on Radio 4. I just didn't want to spoil it, and I thought, I don't think that would be right.
Are you an Archers listener?
I listen. I'm not an addict. I've always dipped in and out. I listen quite a lot now, I can tell you. There's been nothing but Archers on my log since I walked in the door.
I'm just wondering...
This listener felt that some presenters had outstayed their welcome on Radio 4.
Incompetent and wouldn't be able to land a presenter's job now if they went for interview. And you've been very tactful in not mentioning names or time slots.
You absolutely would be astonished if you knew the level of concern and constant editorial discussion that goes into presenters. Just even as an example, I know that Libby's having a day off on midweek, and we've got Anita Anand is coming in to do it. We're constantly looking at and bringing in and on new talent.
Can you explain to us exactly how...
John Clark wanted to know how Gwyneth Williams was going to manage the inevitable cut to Radio 4's budget.
Well, it's a challenge. Radio itself is relatively extremely efficient and delivers extraordinary quality. I'm hoping very much that Radio 4 will not have to take certainly undue punishment.
What's been added, of course, in the last few years is the podcasts, the iPlayer, and so on. Now, you hear amazing tales like In Business is the world's most popular podcast, and The Archers is phenomenally millions of podcasts. What does your podcast research show?
It's sort of lower than 10% of listening. But there's no question it's growing. I think we'll have a schedule, which will be Radio 4's schedule. We'll have it for a long, long time. But I think what will happen is online will develop a sense of Radio 4 with the main interviews, documentaries, dramas that are particularly good that day. And you can go straight to them, download them, and listen to them when it suits you.
The boss of Radio 4 and 4 Extra, Gwyneth Williams. Afterwards, John Clark, who had asked the question about cuts to Radio 4, shared more about his concerns.
Well, I had expected a rather more positive reply, that certain actions were already being taken in spite of the fact that there are consultations still going on within the BBC. But I had really rather hoped that there would be some areas which would be flagged already as absolutely sacrosanct. It is very sad to see it being threatened in this circumstance, and I do hope that the leadership within radio is capable of getting its case across in the face of huge pressures, and that they're able to preserve and move forward one of the most valuable assets that we have in this country.
Well, whatever heated discussions are taking place about those cuts across the BBC, they're all happening behind closed doors. But when we know more, we'll tell you. Now, I don't seem to have any problem falling asleep. I settle down on the couch to watch some late-night evening television and wake up a couple of hours later to find everyone else has gone to bed and there's a glamorous presenter on the box trying to persuade me to play poker. A hopeless task. However, many of you like nothing better than curling up under the duvet in time for book at bedtime and a warm, gentle descent into sweet, dream-strewn sleep. But some of you think the recent choice of books are more likely to give you nightmares. Here's a selection of some recent B@Bs.
On the day they were going to kill him, Santiago Nassar got up at 5:30 in the morning to wait for the boat the bishop was coming.
Yes, I hate you. You are my bane, my poison, my disgust. Oh!
We sat skin to skin, our sweat running together and pooling on the floor.
A cry of despair and weariness emanates from the pit of my stomach.
How could you, Ruth? How could you just dump Anna with me all day while you run around having sex with Fareed?
Am I not the most miserable worm that crawls? Do I not embrace your knees, and you most cruelly repulse me?
Hello, my name's Julia Crookston. I've been listening to Book at Bedtime since 2008, and I'd like to know if there is anyone who has an overview of the content of the books. And I'm asking because ever since Christmas, we seem to have an unremitting diet of murder and some sex scenes, with a few exceptions. Recently, it's been the Jacobean buildings, which has got quite a lot of disturbing stuff in it. Just before that, we had The Absolutist, which was horror of life in the trenches compounded by being gay at the time of the First World War. Caribou Island, oh, that was so depressing. It's not so much that we object to the murder mysteries themselves. In fact, it was a murder mystery that first got us hooked on Book at Bedtime. It's just that it seems to be going on and on and on. We'd just like some light relief, something that reflects the brighter side of life, the nicer side of human nature, that doesn't send us to bed feeling upset. Thank you.
Caroline Raphael is the commissioning editor for the Book at Bedtime slot. I asked how the books are chosen. I think what Julia Crookston is saying effectively is about Book at Bedtime. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord. Do you accept it's been pretty heavy criminal stuff recently?
We do try and look for light and shade. But these are also published books, so to a certain extent we're led by the market, and we do feel that we should be looking at the very best fiction that's out there. But I would agree that when making our choices, we do need to watch a little bit. And it may be that...
Well, do you think it's been grim enough at the moment and that actually, OK, there's some very good choices, but they were a bit relentless in some people's view. Now, a bit of fun so that people can go to bed smiling.
There might be. There might be. We are led by what people want to write about. And I do think that, for example, at the moment we've got the Jacobean building, which is a really important Egyptian novel. And at a time when we're looking at what's happening in the Middle East, it's not a bad time to remind people through fiction and not through factual or news or editorial about how sort of ordinary people live their lives out there and what they might possibly have been rebelling against.
Presumably you're inundated with Book at Bedtime by publishers and their agents desperate for you to feature their books, so you have a great choice. How do you go about deciding what to feature, and how far ahead do you, as it were, book the books?
We probably commission about 3 or 4 months in advance, but equally we may turn around something quite quickly. So the producer of the Yakubian building has turned that round much faster than we would normally expect in response to events that are going on elsewhere. There are some surprising constraints, like, for example, you don't want a book that's very heavily dependent on dialogue. You'd actually find it quite difficult to follow also really clever books that do kind of interesting, innovative things with timescales, with multi-viewpoint presentation. Actually is also quite difficult to abridge. Essentially, they've got to have a narrative that has enough episodes and is sort of straightforward enough. You can actually divide it up into 10 episodes.
How about podcasts? I mean, David Lidderman to the BBC Trust told us in feedback in February that the ambition is to have all programmes available either free or to buy after broadcast. Now, what about books at bedtime? What stops you podcasting those?
There are commercial operations, usually attached to the publishers themselves, who are themselves producing audiobooks. And as you know, the BBC has a responsibility not to go into areas that might damage commercially other people's activities. So at the moment, the Trust has made a decision that book readings are actually excluded from podcasts. They may not be forever, but at the moment they are.
Now, how about the music in Book at Bedtime? Because lots of listeners want to know who wrote it, and they don't get credited, and they wonder why not.
That's a very good question. Putting it onto the credits after each episode on air almost certainly won't happen. It does take up time. It is possible that we could get that information online. At the moment, it's not up there, along with the other programme information, and that's usually because of the way our systems work. That information is put up often before the production's been put to bed, as it were, and the music will almost certainly be the last thing that's added. So no promises, absolutely no promises, but I will see if there's a way that once the music has been chosen and mixed, could the producers, if they have time, go back into the programme pages and just add that information, because some of it is gorgeous. One of your correspondents asked about the music for The Absolutist, the John Boyne, which was gorgeous, and I can tell them that it was Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis. And if possible, I'll ask that producer to put that information on the website.
We'll be watching. My thanks to Caroline Raphael, the commissioning editor who gives you nightmares or a good night's sleep. I hope feedback does neither. Wake up at the back there. Goodbye.
Has been trashed and replaced by Radio 4 Extra.
BBC Radio 4 Extra.
My name's Peter Clark, and I just want to say how dismayed I am by the damage that's been done to BBC Radio 7 by the introduction of seemingly the most trivial elements of Radio 4, which now dominate the schedule and have changed the entire character of the station.
We've been given an EastEnders type Archers. Arthur Smith seems to be on every single day.
Hosted by me, Arthur Smith.
Comedies which I suppose younger people might find funny, and programmes I heard on Radio 4 only a few days ago.
My name is Pauline Midwinter. My husband and I had put a radio alarm clock into our daughter's bedroom as she's 2 years old. I didn't realise the provision for children's radio would just disappear, so I was very surprised when I went in and found her wide-eyed listening to DL and Pasco.
Arnie Stringer opened his eyes for the last time.
We are missing our early morning crime and thrillers. We had swapped it for comedy. Now, I sat up several late nights listening and what is it here? And actually I thought, they're right. You do want to continue with a crime and thriller. And you know what? After 4 weeks of being on air, I tweaked the schedule to change that.
But some lovers of Radio 4's late-night book readings don't want their timbers shivered late at night. Has Radio 4's Book at Bedtime got something of the night about it? And Gwyneth Williams, the controller of Radio 4, reveals how she squashed plans to move the Archers from Radio 4 onto 4 Extra. Research for the BBC Trust discovered that most of those who actually listened to Radio 7 loved it. But there weren't enough of you, hence the rebranding. But many of our correspondents are unhappy about what has been lost in the changeover.
My name's Mike Massey, and I got in touch with feedback because I'm absolutely livid that my favourite radio channel...
List awareness of all the BBC digital networks. It had been quite successful in listening terms, but the listenership was tailing off a bit. My brief was not to make radical changes, and indeed about 85% of the schedule is the same as Radio 7.
Right, well, Ray Streets, what was it you loved about BBC Radio 7, it was formerly known, and that you mourn the passing of?
The distinctive difference from Radio 4. There's a rhythm to each channel, which means if you switch on, you know which one it is without being told. The pattern of mainly longer drama or comedy or single speaker programmes was what was really nice as a listener's experience. Now we have the same sort of choppy magazine feel to far more of 7.
Well, Ray, I'm really sorry to hear you feel that, because I looked at what is there on Radio 7
at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
I want to know who asked you to change it, why did you change it, and who told you that this would be better than the old Radio 7? Give me back my radio station.
Mr. Gus tweeted at BBC R4 Feedback to lament the changes to children's programming on 4 Extra, asking, "To whom do I send my bill for 6 DAB radios which no longer broadcast CBeebies? They said they wanted a younger audience." So, just a few of the 80 or so emails and comments we've had so far since the metamorphosis of 4 Extra 6 weeks ago, and that's on top of lots of comments on the Radio 4 blog, mostly negative. Feedback listener Ray Streets from Cambridge and John Shellard from Barnsley joined me to discuss some of their concerns with Mary Callum-Kerrion, once head of Radio 7, now Radio 4 Extra's head of programming. I started by asking her whether the size of the audience was the key reason for renaming the station.
Radio 7 had a very low awareness.
This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello, I'm back with a new series of Feedback, the programme that gives BBC executives sleepless nights, or so some listeners hope. Sir Michael Lyons is now sleeping soundly as he completed his tour of duty as chairman of the BBC Trust while we were off the air. In his place is Lord Patton, who's been staying up late watching all those distressingly popular programmes on BBC One and listening to all those Radio 1 shows that previously, in his private life, he assiduously avoided. What keeps you awake at night? Many fans of the station formerly known as BBC Radio 7 loved listening to some gripping whodunits in the early hours of the morning, and were dismayed when they were replaced by comedies. Well, have you ever managed to laugh yourself to sleep? The boss of the now retitled 4 Extra explains how she's responded to your clamorous demands for a return to the criminal underworld.
One of the big complaints